I'm going to tell you, when we were recording earlier, for the audience hearing us right now, at the root of this whole thing, I really do think we called it. It's all about polygamy, baby. That's the name of this episode. Just a short, sweet live with you all. And I'm thinking that it's all driven due to the sexual drive of like specifically Joseph Smith, but like a couple other guys
and other men who
were flocking to it,
who have the same issues.
Right.
I mean, like I don't know if I'd call them issues, but it was definitely on William Clayton's mind. It was on Brigham Young's mind. Like, how do I stay faithful, and not commit adultery? Because that's one of the 10 Commandments. And yet I want to like make a pass at this lady.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, Mormonism figured out how to allow for that and called it polygamy.
And there's so many we talked about the fractions that are within the church today. FLDS is still doing this. Are they still doing the like tons of sister wives thing, or is that like, are they raided these areas and like?
Yeah, I think the last, I mean, I'm not an expert on the FLDS where you will see, and there are factions even from within the FLDS. So the sister wives that you'll see probably would say they're not from the FLDS, but they're from a faction of the SLDS, I think, called the Apostolic Brethren. But I think Warren Jeffs, going to prison for aiding and abetting underage marriages and polygamy. So these are 14 and 15-year-old girls who he's either marrying or he's giving them to marriage to other polygamous men. He went to prison for that. And there was huge court cases, huge documentary evidence about what really happened. And it really dismantled the entire church. Where I live in St. George, Utah, is where the FLDS headquarters are, just further south to the Arizona border from us. So if you went out there during the Warren Jeffs era, there would have been, it would look like Little House on the Prairie girls running around, dresses. I mean, it really did look very, old fashioned. After Warren Jeffs was put into prison, the church is just, the FLDS church is just out there, has gone through reformation after reformation. There's now a female mayor, a woman mayor that was elected for their city. And she's super amazing. Good. She'd be great for you to interview sometime on your channel.
About it?
About polygamy and from a woman's perspective.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
And like Warren Jeffs' property was seized and now it's up for sale. And I have actual friends who have purchased some of that property and they're turning them into bed and breakfasts. So the whole FLDS thing is, at least in Utah, has pretty much fizzled out. But there's still, of course,
little offshoots,
which I don't know that will ever change.
We got a comment here. Feel free to comment if you or if you have a question, feel free to do that as well. It says DC says not just Smith, Sidney Rigdon was one of many involved in previous attempts to start polygamous cults. The Vermont New Israelites. Have you heard of that?
So I don't know. I mean, unless there's something DC knows that I don't know, which is very possible. But Sidney Rigdon, what he was really responsible for starting was a congregation of kind of a communalist type of situation where everyone had the same. There's no poor among us, and everyone is
share your wife with mine.
It was more about wealth, right? It was more about wealth and resources and housing.
Kind of like Acts in the book.
It was Acts. It was based upon Acts for sure. And so Sidney Rigdon meets Joseph Smith and brings his whole congregation over to Joseph Smith. But Sidney Rigdon didn't know anything about polygamy, and they weren't practicing polygamy. In fact, it's not. Joseph Smith made an attempt to make an offer to Sidney Rigdon's daughter, Nancy, to enter into a polygamous marriage with him. And it was so controversial. It made Nancy very upset. Sidney Rigdon left the church over polygamy. So I doubt that Sidney Rigdon was practicing polygamy, or he wouldn't have left the church over polygamy. Oliver Cowdery wasn't practicing polygamy. I mean, the original founders found this to be crazy and abhorrent. And that's partly why it was, kept secret. It was also kept secret because Emma Joseph's wife.
Oh gosh,
wanted
don't
nothing
give away
to do with
too
it.
much.
Okay, all right.
No, but someone said in here in the chat, William says, I can't say non-polygamy works out fine also for many people. So the idea that polygamy isn't necessarily a bad thing. What we're dealing with, and this is the thing, like people who want to have multiple partners, we're not judging any of it. What you're going to discover, especially in the higher quality video, and I think we can tease them with it. It's just we really spell it out, is how this is not a fair system to begin with. This system, as portrayed in the early Mormon church and on, even to the recent FLDS chaos that we find with hundreds of sister wives and all that crazy stuff that you find, is a man's system to benefit the man only. And this has its roots right there in Emma. Yeah. And like, this could have been fixed by Joseph.
Yes.
Right there.
Right. At the first affair.
But he was just. But
he couldn't. Yeah. So I think that that comment's interesting, because I'm not here to say that, like, I mean, it's true that in the 19th century, there were Mormon leaders and other spiritual leaders that were trying to, like, how do you deal with the fact that adulteries, happens and still stay religious, right? And, for many Mormons, that meant, well, let's just marry you and have multiple wives. That doesn't solve this problem, if you want to call it a problem. What is more important to understand is, like, human sexuality, and that human sexuality is real, it's dynamic, it's fluid, and comprehensive. And so it's important that you are communicating with your partners, that you're communicating with your spouses,
but or if you have to do what Joseph Smith
when you have to create a religious system to support your sexual escapades,
it was so bad. Just wait till you see.
Then you can't. Then it's not. It really, what it does is it's very hurtful toward women.
Oh, for sure, without a doubt, and it's definitely not fair to them. And you're going to hear that as these videos come rolling out. Maybe we'll have to make another trip and really dive into some of the female testimonies and stuff that I'm sure are out there. Any opinions on the SEC finding the church?
I have a lot of opinions about that. So the SEC is the Security Exchange Commission, for those that are wondering about the SEC. And the SEC requires, even not-for-profits, they're required to file information on where they're investing their money. Mm-hmm. And that's only required when you're over a certain amount of money in investments. And this really came out of the time of the Great Depression, right? When the stocks and the security exchange and all those things happening in the stock market, there was a problem with transparency, which is part of what led to the stock market crash back in the 1920s. So in the 1930s, these laws came forward through the Securities Exchange Commission to manage investment in portfolios and to provide transparency for large investment portfolios, so that investors knew what they were, participating in, and what large investors were actually doing. So the SEC would require this reporting, and the Mormon Church in the 90s had a $39 billion portfolio, and they didn't want to report publicly on that large portfolio and where they were investing. So they didn't want to. They wanted to avoid these filings, and so they intentionally hid that money by creating 12. It's interesting that they use the number 12. So they created 12 new companies so that they could allocate the $39 billion and spread it out between the 12 companies. And when they did that, it meant that they didn't meet that threshold for reporting anymore. So it literally hides the money. They made up weird names for these companies, like Apricot Research Reserves, silly names. And then they asked church employees to pretend as though they were the managers of each of those companies. And so what started happening is these managers began to realize, I'm signing off on a form that we're submitting to the SEC on a company that I'm supposedly managing, but doesn't have really any money in it. Mm-hmm. So then two of these money managers began to realize they were doing something fraudulent. And so they whistle blew to the SEC. The SEC did a full investigation in that full investigation, they learned that the church was intentionally hiding its investment portfolios to the tune of $150 billion of investments. And as a result, fined the church like $5 million for their inability, for their violations of these filings. What I think people should know is that not only is the SEC investigating, but so is the IRS. And I think the SEC is probably going to be the tip of the iceberg. I think that what they avoided in taxes is probably a whole nother story. So that $5 million is just fines for failure to report accurately or appropriately.
They were glad to spend that.
They're glad to spend that.
Get it off of our backs.
And it's not very much money. It's pennies for the church. But we don't know what this is going to mean from an IRS perspective. Yeah. And so that's still an ongoing investigation.